Welcome to Web Development Through Practice. In the last video, we discussed Laravel collections and some of their methods. If you haven't seen that video yet, I recommend watching it first to better understand the content of this video. Because, in this session, we will cover the remaining collection methods with practical examples. First, let's talk about the combine method. It merges two collections into one, where the first collection becomes the keys and the second collection becomes the values. Now, let's see some practical examples of the combined method. I already have a collection controller with a method called testCollection methods. First, we create a collection called $keys with the elements name, email, and age. Next, we define another collection called $values with John Doe, john@example.com, and 28. Now, we use the combine method on the $keys collection, pass $values as an argument, and store them into the $user variable. Then, to display the result, we use the all method and save the file. Now to run the code, I have already set up a route in web.php that maps to testCollection methods. Now, open a browser and enter the URL testCollection methods. Here, you can see that both collections have merged into one, where the first collection acts as keys and the second as values. Here, an important note is that the combine method only works with two collections at a time. You cannot merge multiple collections with it. Next, you can also pass an array instead of a collection. For example, if we remove the collect method from $values and use a simple array instead, it will still work the same way. The next method is concat, which adds new elements from another collection or an array to the end. It returns a new collection with reindexed numeric keys. Let's see some practical examples of the concat method. We already have a collection called $keys and an array called $values. Instead of using the combine method, we replace it with the concat method and save the file. When we refresh the browser, we see that the elements from $values add to the $keys collection. Next, we go back to the file, replace the array $values with a collection, save the file, and refresh the page again. The result stays the same, showing that the concat method works with both arrays and collections. We also use the concat method with multi-dimensional collections. For example, we define $collection1 with elements ID1, name Alice, and ID2, name Bob. Then, we define $collection2 with elements ID3, name Charlie, and ID4, name David. Now, we apply the concat method on $collection1 and pass $collection2 as an argument. After saving the file and refreshing the page, we see that both collections merge successfully. This shows how the concat method easily combines simple or multi-dimensional collections. You can see that the concat method numerically reindexes keys when adding new items to a collection. If we apply the concat method to an associative array, the keys do not stay the same. For example, if $collection1 contains name John, age 30, and $collection2 contains age 35, email john@example.com, after applying the concat method and saving the file, the new elements from $collection2 get reindexed. If you want to preserve keys, use the merge method instead of the concat method. So, we replace the concat method with the merge method, save the file, and refresh the page. Now, both $collection1 and $collection2 merge while keeping their original keys. The merge method merges the given array or collection with the original collection. If both collections have the same key, the value from the second collection overrides the value from the first. For example, if $collection2 also has a name key with the value Nick, it replaces John in $collection1. Refresh the page, and you will see that name John is now name Nick. Now, for numeric keys, the merge method appends values instead of replacing them. For example, If $collection1 contains desk, chair, and $collection2 contains bookcase, door, after merging, the result is desk, chair, bookcase, door. Refresh the page, and you will see the new items added at the end. The next method is the contains method, which checks if a value exists in a collection. It can check a single value, a key-value pair, or use a callback function. Let's see some practical examples of the contains method. First, we define a collection $collection with the values 10, 20, 30, 40. Then, we call the contains method on $collection, check for the value 20, and print the result using var_dump. When we refresh the browser, it returns true because 20 exists in the collection. If we replace 20 with 50 and refresh again, it returns false since 50 is not present. Next, we check if a collection contains a specific key-value pair. We define $collection as a multi-dimensional array with ID1, name Alice, and ID2, name Bob. Then, we use the contains method to check if name Alice exists. After refreshing the page, it returns true because the key-value pair is found in the collection. Now, let's use a callback function with the contains method to check for a condition. We define $collection with 10, 20, 30, 40 again and use a callback function inside the contains method that checks if any value is greater than 25. When we refresh the browser, it returns true because 30 and 40 are greater than 25. A function without a name is called an anonymous function or closure in PHP. Finally, if we define $collection as an associative array with name John, age 30, and check if John exists, the contains method returns true because it checks values, not keys. After refreshing the browser, we can see the correct result. Now, on the Laravel official website, it is noted that the contains method uses loose comparisons when checking item values. This means that a string with an integer value is considered equal to an integer of the same value. To perform a strict comparison, we use the contains strict method instead. The contains strict method works similarly to the contains method, but it performs a strict comparison, meaning it checks both the value and the data type. Let's see some practical examples of the contains strict method. In our example, if we check for the single value 30 as a string using the contains method and refresh the page, it returns true because Laravel performs a loose comparison, meaning the 30 string is considered equal to 30 integers. Now, to apply strict comparison, we replace the contains method with the contains strict method, save the file, and refresh the page. This time, it returns false because the 30 string is not strictly equal to 30 integers. The contains strict method checks both the value and the data type, so a string 30 is not considered the same as an integer 30. Now, let's look at the inverse of the contains method, the doesn't contain method. The doesn't contain method checks if a given value, key-value pair, or condition does not exist in the collection. It returns true if the value is not found, otherwise, it returns false. Let's see some practical examples of the doesn't contain method. First, let's check if a collection does not contain a specific value. We update the $collection elements to 10, 20, 30, 40, replace the contains strict method with the doesn'tContain method, and check for the value 25. After saving the file and refreshing the browser, it returns true because 25 is not in the collection. Next, let's check if a collection does not contain a specific key-value pair. We define $collection as a multi-dimensional array with ID1, name Alice, and ID2, name Bob. Then, we check if name Charlie exists. After saving the file and refreshing the page, it returns true because Charlie is not present in the name field. Now, let's use a callback function with the doesn't_contain method. We define $collection as 10, 20, 30, 40 and pass an anonymous function inside the doesn't contain method that checks if any value is greater than 50. After saving and refreshing the browser, it returns true because no values are greater than 50. The doesn't contain method is useful when ensuring that a value is missing, such as for form field validation. The doesn't contain method uses loose comparisons. If we check for a string 30, it returns false because integer 30 exists in the collection, and Laravel treats string 30 as equal to integer 30 due to loose comparison. To apply strict comparison, we use a callback function with the strict comparison operator. After saving the file and refreshing the browser, it now returns true because the string 30 is not strictly equal to integer 30. Now, the next method is the contains one item method, which checks whether a collection has exactly one item. It returns true if the collection contains only one item, otherwise, it returns false. Let's see some practical examples of the contains one item method. First, let's see the contains one item method with a single item. In our example, we remove the values 20, 30, and 40, keeping only 10 in the collection. Then, we replace the doesn't contain method with the contains the one item method, save the file, and refresh the browser. It returns true because the collection contains only one element. Next, let's try with multiple items. We restore the collection with the elements 10, 20, 30, 40, save the file, and refresh the browser. This time, it returns false because the collection contains more than one element. Now, let's test with an empty collection. We remove all elements, save the file, and refresh the browser. The result is false because the collection has no elements. So, the contains one item method is useful when you need to check if a collection has exactly one element. Next, let's look at the count method. The count method returns the total number of items in a collection. On the Laravel official website, you can see an example where the collection contains 4 items. When using the count method, it returns the integer 4, representing the total number of items in the collection. Now, let's move on to the count by method. The count by method is used to count the occurrences of values in a collection. Let's see some practical examples of the count by method. In our example, we define $collection with the items as 10, 20, 30, 40, and replace the contains one item method with the count by method. To display the collection as an array, we use the all method and save the file. Now, when we refresh the page in the browser, we see that each element in the collection occurs one time, so Laravel assigns a count of 1 to each item. Next, we update the collection to include 10 twice and 33 times, then save the file. After refreshing the page, we see that Laravel counts 10 twice and 33 times, and the remaining numbers appear once. Laravel automatically counts how many times each value appears. Now, let's use a callback function. We update the collection with apple, banana, avocado, blueberry, and apricot, and use a callback function to group by the first letter. After saving the file and refreshing the page, we see that Laravel groups the items by their first letter and counts them. The letter A appears 3 times, and B appears twice. Next, we use the count by method to count even and odd numbers. We define $collection with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and use a callback function to check whether a number is even or odd. After saving the file and refreshing the page, Laravel groups the numbers into odd and even and counts them. Finally, we can count by a specific key. We define $collection as category tech, category fashion, category tech, and category food. Then, we pass category into the count by method and save the file. After refreshing the page, Laravel counts how many times each category appears in the dataset. So, the count by method is great for categorizing and grouping data efficiently. The next method is the DD method, which stands for dump and die. It is used to debug collections or any data in Laravel. This method dumps the collection items, meaning it prints the collection data and immediately stops the execution of the script. If there is any code after the DD method, it will not be executed. Let's see some practical examples of the DD method. In our example, we update the $collection items to 10, 20, 30, 40, and replace the count by method with the DD method. We also remove the print function because the DD method automatically prints the collection. Next, we add a simple echo message after the DD method to check if execution stops after calling it. Then, we save the file and refresh the page in the browser. Here, you can see that the collection items are printed and execution stops. The echo message does not appear, proving that the DD method stops execution. Now, if you don't want to stop execution, you can use the dump method instead. So, we replace the DD method with the dump method, save the file, and refresh the page. You can now see the collection items along with the echo message because execution continues. So, the DD method is useful for debugging collections, arrays, queries, and variables when you want to stop execution. If you just want to inspect data without stopping execution, use the dump method. The next method is the diff method. The diff method compares two collections or arrays and returns the values that exist in the first collection but not in the second one. It performs a value-based comparison and ignores keys. Let's see some practical examples of the diff method. In our existing example, we define $collection1 with the items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next, we define $collection2 with the items 2, 4, 6, and apply the diff method to $collection1. This method returns the values from $collection1 that are not present in $collection2. After that, we use the all method to print the result and save the file. Now, we refresh the page in the browser to see the result. Here, values 2 and 4 exist in both collections, so they are removed from $collection1. The remaining values 1, 3, and 5 are returned from $collection1. Next, we replace $collection2 with a plain PHP array by removing the collect method and saving the file. After refreshing the page, it returns the same result. So, the diff method can be used with simple arrays, associative arrays, and multidimensional arrays. However, the diff method only compares two collections at a time. Next, on the Laravel official website, there is a note below the diff method displaying, this method's behavior is modified when using eloquent collections. Here, eloquent collections refer to collections that provide an expressive and fluent way to work with eloquent models like user, product, and more, which are retrieved from the database. This means you can use the diff method directly on eloquent model collections to compare database records efficiently. Let's see some practical examples of the diff method with eloquent models. Now, let's implement the diff collection method with the user eloquent model. In a Laravel project, the user model is automatically generated, so we only need to include it in our code. Before proceeding, ensure that the users table exists in the database. Here, I have 50 users in the users table. Now, first, we retrieve all users from the database using the user models all method and store the result in the $users variable. Next, let's say we want to remove users with IDs 1, 2, and 3. To do this, we fetch these users using the where condition and store the result in the $removed users variable. Now, we apply the diff method on $users, passing $removed users as an argument. This will return a new collection that removes users with IDs 1, 2, and 3. We store this filtered collection in the $filtered users variable. Then, we print the $filtered users collection and save the file. When we refresh the page in the browser, we will see that users start with 4 means IDs 1, 2, and 3 have been successfully removed from the collection. To see a clear result, we use pluck ID, which extracts only the IDs from the collection, and save the file. Then you can see the result where user IDs 1, 2, and 3 are removed. Similarly, the diff method can be used to filter database records based on different conditions. The next method is the differSOC method. As we saw earlier, the diff method compares two collections or arrays, but it only checks for values and ignores keys. The differSOC method, on the other hand, compares two collections or arrays while checking both keys and values. It returns key-value pairs that are only present in the first collection. Let's explore some practical examples of the differSOC method. Let's take a basic example using associative arrays. First, we define $collection1 with the elements A1, B2, C3. Next, we define $collection2 with the elements B2, C5, D4. We then apply the differSOC method on $collection1, passing $collection2 as an argument. This method compares both the keys and values of the two collections and returns the key-value pairs that exist only in $collection1 or have different values in $collection2. Now, print the result and save the file, and by refreshing the browser, we can see the result. The key appears in the output because it does not exist in $collection2. The key B is removed because it exists in both collections with the same value. The key C appears in the result because, although it exists in $collection2, its value is different, 35. The key D is ignored because differSOC only checks for differences in $collection1, not new keys present in $collection2. This method is useful when comparing associative arrays where both keys and values matter. The next method is the differSOC using method, which works similarly to the differSOC method, but it allows a custom callback function for key comparison. This method provides more flexibility when comparing keys, as you can define your own comparison logic. The callback function must return 1 if the first key is less than the second key, 0 if both keys are equal, and 1 if the first key is greater than the second key. Internally, Laravel uses PHP's array_diff_SOC function for this method. You can refer to the PHP documentation for more details on how it works. Now, let's look at some practical examples of the differSOC using method. Let's take an example of case-insensitive string comparison using the differSOC using method. In this example, we update $collection1 with elements user1 alias, user2 Bob. Next, we define $collection2 with the element user2 Bob. Now, we replace the differSOC method with differSOC using and provide a callback function to perform a case-insensitive key comparison. After saving the file, we refresh the browser to see the result. Here's what happens. User1 alias remains in the output because it does not exist in $collection2. User2 Bob is removed because user2 Bob exists in $collection2, and the comparison is case-insensitive. The differSOC using method is useful when comparing associative arrays or collections while applying custom business logic for key comparisons. The next method is the diffKeys method. The diffKeys method compares two collections or arrays and returns the items that exist in the first collection but not in the second collection, based only on the keys. It completely ignores the values and checks only the keys. Now, let's look at some practical examples of the diffKeys method. We continue with the same example, replacing the differSOC using method with the diffKeys method and saving the file. Now, refresh the page in the browser to see the result. Here, you can see that it returns user1 alias from $collection1. Since both $collection1 and $collection2 contain the same key user2, it is removed. The method only returns the key value pairs from $collection1 that have keys not present in $collection2. The next method is the dot method. The dot method in Laravel flattens a multi-dimensional collection into a single-level collection using dot notation for the keys. Here, flattens means converting a multi-dimensional array or collection into a single-level structure by removing nested levels. Now, let's look at some practical examples of the dot method. To implement the dot method, we first define $collection as a multi-dimensional array. The array contains a user key with elements name John and email john@example.com. Inside the user key, we define a nested address array with elements city New York and zip 10,001. Next, we apply the dot method to $collection and store the result in $result. Then, we print the $result. After saving the file, we go to the browser and refresh the page. The output shows that multi-dimensional keys are flattened into a single-level array. Nested elements are represented using dot notation, such as user.address.city instead of an array inside the user. The next method is the duplicates method. The duplicates method retrieves and returns duplicate values from a collection. In the given example, the $collection contains the letters A twice and B twice. Applying the duplicates method returns only the duplicate values, which are A and B. It is important to note that the first occurrence of a value is ignored, only subsequent occurrences are returned along with their original keys. For example, the result is 2A, 4B. Next, if the collection contains arrays or objects, you can pass the key of the attribute you want to check for duplicate values. For example, if the $employees collection contains an array of employees, you can check for duplicates in the position key. The result, to developer, means that the first occurrence is ignored and only the later duplicate is returned. The next method is the duplicates strict method. Works similarly to the duplicates method, but it uses strict comparison instead of loose comparison. This means that 5 a string and 5 an integer are not treated as duplicates. This method is useful when you need an exact match, considering both type and value. Next is the each method in Laravel loops through each item in a collection and applies a callback function to it. In the given example, the $collection contains 1, 2, 3, 4. When using the each method, it iterates over each item and applies the callback function. If you want to stop the iteration, you can return false from your callback function, which will prevent further execution. We will discuss the remaining collection methods in the next video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content.